Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grace Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video, we're not going to be doing an alternative history as we normally do. Instead, we're going to be looking at something which is quite current affairs, which is Israel and Palestine and the conflict around that. But, you know, to anyone who looks at this objectively and kind of takes a step back, as difficult as it is to do, when we kind of look at it, we kind of think, why do people support this country or that country? You know, they have no connections to it. They live like thousands of miles away. They've never been to this place. So why do they care so much about what's going on in this conflict? And, you know, when we compare it to like Armenia and Azerbaijan earlier this year, you know, they were in a war. People didn't tend to be as animated about it. You know, it was on the news, but people kind of like, okay, whatever. And, you know, similarly as well in Ethiopia, there was some civil unrest in the Tigray region. See, I don't even know how to pronounce it properly. Apologies like for the people who are there. But like people, again, are not as animated, right? There's conflicts and there's civil wars and there's, you know, there's genocide and stuff happening all around the world. But for some reason, anytime Israel or Palestine ends up on the news, people get very, very heated about it, right? And so this video is going to try and look objectively and as neutral as possible, as difficult as it is for a topic like this. And we're going to try and break down why different groups support Israel and why different groups support Palestine. Now, the support for either of these countries can basically be summarized into three different categories. 1, nationalism. 2, religion. And 3, politics. So on the one hand, you have Jewish nationalism, which is often referred to as Zionism. So this is basically the aspiration of the Jewish people to have their own homeland in their historic homeland of Israel, right? So that's what Jews for the last 2,000 years have basically wanted, yeah. All the times when they've been expelled from places and, you know, the Jewish diaspora all around the world, they've always kind of wanted to come back to Israel, yeah, and to have their own homeland, yeah, free from persecution, free from genocides, etc., etc. So that's essentially what the Jews have always wanted. And then on the flip side, you have Arab nationalism, right? So this is obviously something which has kind of arisen in the last 100 years or so, or a little bit earlier. And this is the desire of the Arabs to basically have, in particular, one nation state, kind of, or at very least for each nation within like the Arab League to be able to be self-governing and stuff, yeah, so not being controlled by outside forces. And so this has kind of manifested itself within this conflict to the creation of the Palestinian sense of nationhood, right? So in particular, like since 1967, you know, because before that there wasn't really a sense of being a Palestinian, because Gaza was controlled by Egypt and West Bank was controlled by Jordan. But as with anything, yeah, nationalism tends to be more a definition of what you're not rather than what you are. So in the context of like, you know, Israel occupying the Palestinians, it became a thing where Palestinian nationalism was defined as being in opposition to Israeli occupation. So that's kind of where that kind of arises from. Now, the second category is to do with religion, right? So on the one hand, you have people supporting Israel who tend to be religious Jews. So like these are people who, you know, they read the Bible, obviously, and like, you know, as I've said, like they trying to create like a actual Jewish like homeland and stuff, like in the sense of a religious Jewish community rather than just a secular nationalism, which was kind of what a lot of the earlier settlers to the Jewish state wanted. Yeah, so they want to basically be able to have all of like what is referred to as the Holy Land for the Jews, yeah, and this is in accordance with the history of the Jewish people and stuff, yeah, like yeah, they didn't really factor in the fact that like there's going to be Arabs there and stuff. They don't really factor in there's going to be Muslims or Christians, etc., etc. They want the state of Israel to be a state for Jews only. And on top of that, you also have people from the evangelical Christian community and stuff. So these are people predominantly in the US, and they have like a lot of influence and power within the US government. And for them, they very much, you know, they obviously have read the Bible as well, like they're biblical literalists. And so, for instance, where it talks at the end of the Bible in like Revelations, where it's talking about Armageddon and the second coming of Christ and stuff, and how like end times is all tied up with like when all the Jews come back to Israel, then like kind of like Jesus can come back, and it's all very kind of complicated stuff, yeah. So that's kind of a major reason why like the evangelicals want it, because like they are very much in support of Israel for religious reasons, and they feel that it's the fulfillment of prophecy and stuff, like biblical prophecy. And then on the flip side, you have Muslims around the world who obviously, Jerusalem is the third holiest city in Islam. It's the site at which the Prophet Muhammad rose to heaven. So that's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's recently where like all the tensions kind of flared up from, because the Israelis during Ramadan basically, in light of COVID, tried to like restrict the amount of people going there in Ramadan to about like 10,000 people, and obviously the Muslims there were obviously very annoyed by this, and that's kind of how a lot of this more recent tension started. So for them, like having control over like the third holiest site in Islam is very, very important. They don't want any kind of negotiations between that, because like for them it's like very, very important as well. And then finally, you have the third category, which, as I said, was politics, right? So what I mean by this is, broadly speaking, talking about, the mainline, like kind of like a right-wing thought within Western politics. And then on the other side, talking about the left-wing side, right? So, the right in Western politics today tends to be more supportive of Israel, and the left wing tends to be more in support of Palestine. Obviously, there's some nuances. Obviously, you have some people on the left who are in favour of Israel, and you have some people on the right who are in favour of Palestine. But broadly speaking, this is broadly how the two groups kind of split off. So out of these three categories, the one I'm going to spend the most time kind of focused on for this video is going to be that final one with regard to politics, because on the face of it, we can understand the religious side of it, why people support it there. You can understand the nationalist side and why people support it there. And I suppose in both of those kind of categories, there's not much room for nuance, there's not much room for compromise. It's very much like an us versus them kind of thing. And it's like, especially with the religious side of it, you can't really, there's no negotiation where God's involved, right? If you believe that like your God is basically saying, like, this should be owned by these people, and the other person's God is saying this should be owned by these people, there's not much room for kind of compromise and stuff, right? But when it comes to like the broadly speaking, the right wing of politics and the left wing of politics, on the face of it, why does one side support Israel and the other side support Palestine? So broadly speaking, talking about like the right wing of like British and American and like just European politics in general, broadly, because obviously the right wing is a very broad kind of thing to talk about. But broadly speaking, it's a thing where they support Israel because Israel is Western, it's liberal, it's secular, and it's a democratic society, right? And it's also a multi-ethnic, multi-racial, multi-faith society, right? In which anyone can go, right? Like anyone is like free to go to Israel. Like there's not like discrimination against women. There's not discrimination against gays and stuff. There's not discrimination. Like there is discrimination against minorities, and we'll get onto that in a little bit. But broadly speaking, compared to other places in the Middle East, like Israel is kind of a beacon of like democratic like values and stuff, right? In a sea of basically theocratic states or authoritarian states. So in many ways, like people in the West, like kind of who are supporters of like freedom and capitalism and the democracy, etc., they tend to look at Israel and say, actually, we support that because we have a lot of things in common with them. Now, to talk about the left and broadly why they support Palestine, that's quite a complicated thing because, if you think about like, mainstream, like kind of like left-wing people in Britain or in America, by and large, you tend to see a thing where, they're obviously in support of like LGBT rights, they're in favour of feminism, they're in favour of this, etc., etc. They're in favour of like democracy and on like rule of law and all those kind of things, which, you'd expect like a Western liberal, secular, democratic society, you'd expect them on the face of it to support Israel. However, many people on the left, not all of them again, obviously, but many people on the left tend to support Palestine. Now, why would people support Palestine when Palestine is, predominantly people who are, very religious, they're very traditional when it comes to like kind of like gender norms and stuff like that, and also when it comes to LGBT rights. Yeah, put it this way, you couldn't have a protest saying, gays for Palestine in Palestine itself, right? I wouldn't get very far. So on the face of it, one would expect the Western left to support Israel. On the other hand, the reason why they tend to support it, and actually I've like spoken to like people who are on the left about this just to make sure that I'm not kind of, it's not just coming like from my own thing here, right? And it's because broadly speaking, the left views the world in terms of oppressor and oppressed, between victimizer and victim, right? Between strong and weak. And so when they see on the news, a relatively small, weak country being occupied by a much larger, more powerful one with like much greater like military like prowess and stuff, people instinctively decide to like back like the weaker one, right? Because they tend to see, if someone's weaker, then it's a thing where like, the person who's like stronger than them is being a bully, right? So that's basically where that kind of comes from. And the real test for this, would be to ask this kind of, hopefully not a rhetorical question. Hopefully in the comment section, people respectfully, like kind of like actually answer this, And it's this, right? So to test out these two theories, first of all, talking about the right wing of Western politics, right? So if Israel became a theocratic, illiberal, racist, totalitarian state, would the right wing of Western politics support it? I don't mean like evangelicals. I know a lot of evangelical Christians tend to be on the right, especially within America and stuff, But I don't necessarily mean that. I mean just mainline kind of like right wing people within the West and stuff, Basically classical liberals for all intents and purposes. Would they still be in support of the state of Israel? And then on the flip side, if the balance of power was basically to be shifted, if it was a thing where, at very least there was parity between the Israelis and the Palestinians, or even to illustrate the point even more, if it were a situation where the Palestinians had the large army, if they had nuclear weapons, if they had chemical weapons, if they had the means basically to occupy Israel, would the left, within Western politics support Palestine still, or would they suddenly shift their like support to Israel? Is it basically just a thing of rooting for the underdog, or is it a thing of support for a Palestine like kind of unconditionally? And I think this is the thing I've tended to find with this final category and stuff, and let me know what you think in the comment section, But broadly speaking, it seems to me that it's a situation where when it comes to the politics category, it seems that the support for Israel or for Palestine is conditional on the current status quo being maintained, right? So as long as Israel remains Western and liberal and democratic and secular, the right wing of British and American politics, etc., they will tend to like support Israel. On the flip side, if the balance of power between Israel and Palestine was suddenly to shift towards the Palestinian side, I think that they would be more in support of the new underdog, which would be Israel in that case. So in both cases, it seems to be a conditional thing, but let me know what you think in the comments of that before we get into like the whole rest of the video. Right, so now that we've gone through the first part of this, we looked at, why people support one side or the other. Now in the second part, we're going to kind of look at the conflict a little bit more and kind of unpick some of the things with it. And the main thing that I've kind of realised, having been to Israel and Palestine myself and seen it for myself and everything, and, spoken to people on the ground, spoken to Israelis on the ground, spoken to Palestinians on the ground, etc. And what I tend to find is that, in most situations in life, you could kind of say the same thing for like, left and right wing politics in this country and elsewhere in the world. It's quite difficult to have a dialogue with people if you don't understand the other people's like point of view, right? If you don't understand their talking points. And so, that's kind of the main thing to really bear in mind with this, It's a thing of, how many people, when you're talking about Israel or Palestine, how many of them, if they're pro-Israel, like how many of them actually understand the talking points for the Palestinian side? And similarly, if you support the Palestinian side, how much are you aware of like the talking points of the Israeli side? And on top of that, I've realised that the debate about it is very much a question of when do you start the history from, right? And that might sound a bit strange, but, for many people, like if you're starting the conversation from 1967, you tend to obviously be like a pro-Palestinian because since 1967, with the occupation of West Bank and Gaza, etc., that from that point on, it seems that Israel is obviously the dominant power and Palestine is the much weaker power. And so many people, if they're starting the history from that point, they will have a certain point of view. Similarly as well, if you start the history from 1948 with the creation of the State of Israel, then that's also another like talking point, right? And some people as well will also have the talking point starting almost 100 years ago with the Balfour Declaration. This is when the British decided that they were going to split the region between a Jewish homeland and an Arab homeland, right? So again, depend on when you start history from is very much dependent on like where you kind of go at it from, because all those that are just kind of laid out there tend to be talking points that the Arab side tend to have, whereas if you take a look at it from the Jewish side, you have to take in consideration at least the last 3,000 years of history in that region and in the rest of the world, before you can fully kind of like come to terms with it. So that's very much the kind of thing, like how aware are people of the actual deeper history of these things, right? And just looking at objectively, like it's one will kind of be skewed one way or the other, but I think a lot of people tend not to have this very broad view. Most people, they see what's on the news. They see like a very powerful Israeli army bombing very like kind of poor people like kind of who are like largely defenseless and stuff. And if you just stop the presses there and don't understand the wider context of it, then it becomes a quite black and white kind of thing, right? But if you kind of take in consideration the entire history of that region, then it becomes a little bit more complicated. So that's kind of what we're going to go into now. So for instance, if we were to start it, with the creation of the state of Israel, right? Many Palestinians make the point of the so-called Nakba, right? This is in Arabic. That means that the catastrophe, right? So this is the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinian Arabs from the land which is now Israel, right? And if you kind of, again, if you just look at the thing there and just, then it becomes very much a thing where, it's a kind of like a settler, like a colonial settler kind of like society, where you've expelled like the natives and, so that's one way of looking at it. However, the flip side of that is that in the Middle East, at the time of the creation of Israel, there was up to 1 million Jews living in that region, right? And the question is, what happened to those Jews after Israel was created, right? Did they, were they living in peace? Like, did they just like decide to chill there? No, there's something called the Aliyah. I'm probably butchering the Hebrew word there, right? But it's a thing where, like over the first 3 years of Israel's creation, between 1948 and 1951, you had the expulsion of about 250,000 Jews from Middle Eastern countries. And over the preceding decades, it ended up being a thing where up to 850,000 Jews were expelled from different Muslim countries, right? So places like Morocco, places like Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, many of these places, Yemen, they had sizable Jewish communities beforehand. Look at the communities now. They're almost non-existent. In some cases, there's literally officially 0 Jews living in some of these countries, right? And so, everything's all hunky-dory there. Why did so many of them leave? And the reality is that many of them were expelled. And even before the creation of the State of Israel, you had a lot of discrimination against Jews by the Arabs and like Muslims in that kind of region in general. And this is something we discussed in our previous videos about like, the history of anti-Semitism. And, so definitely give those videos a check out. Like kind of, there should be links in the description somewhere or wherever, or it should appear on the screen at some point. But, like that's the whole point. Like kind of like Jews were not safe in the Middle East, and they weren't safe in Europe. They weren't safe anywhere they've been. So, they've been expelled time and time again. So you can understand from a Jewish perspective why they'd be quite paranoid and why sometimes they might overreact when they're trying to do things, because, Israel is a tiny, tiny little country, You can drive across it, like when you go in a bus, you can kind of drive across the entire thing in about 45 minutes or so. It's a tiny, tiny place. At its shortest point, it's something like 19 miles, wide, right? And, from their perspective, having people firing rockets into their country when their country is quite tiny as it is, you can kind of get where they're coming from. When they're surrounded by like hostile neighbors, many of whom several times have tried to completely wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Like when you have people like Hamas, like kind of, on state TV, indoctrinating kids to basically be suicide bombers and to kill Jews, etc., etc., you can kind of understand from their perspective why they might be a bit paranoid and why they might want to like overreact, like kind of to what on the face of it might just be a few missiles, right? And then also when you talk about like occupation, how many people, for instance, know that in the year 2000, the Israeli Prime Minister Barak, he offered for 100% of Gaza to be given to the Palestinians, and for 73% of West Bank to be given to the Palestinians, with there to be a phase-in system over the next like 10 to 25 years, so pretty much almost the time that like we're talking about right now. Yeah, like, 25 years after 2000, it's almost now, right? So they would have given them up to 92% of West Bank. So how many people are aware of that Israel time and time again has offered land to be given to the Palestinians, and they said, right, all you've got to do is, just agree to not like attack us anymore and to recognize our right to exist. And when that was offered, the Palestinians said no. So it's quite difficult to compromise, yeah, in a conflict like this, yeah, right, where you have people who under no circumstances are willing to give land at all. And also, there's another talking point that people say with regard to Israel being an apartheid state. So if it's an apartheid state, yeah, I'm not saying that there's no discrimination against Arabs there, but within Israel proper, there's about 20% of its population which are Arab speaking, right? In the northern region of Israel, there's actually a majority of people who live there who are Arabs. And while from 1948 to 1967, they were living under military occupation from the Israeli government, since 1967, they've had full citizen rights of Israel. They serve in the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament. And while Jews are conscripted into the Israeli army, for the Israeli Arabs, they are allowed to volunteer to join, and many of them do. So I'm not saying that there's no discrimination against the Israeli Arabs, but how many people, for instance, are aware that in the year 2004, you had Lieberman, I don't know how to pronounce his first name, I'm not going to try, right? But Lieberman, suggested there to be the so-called Lieberman plan. Some of the territory within West Bank is controlled by the Jews, controlled by Jewish settlers, and obviously, as I just said, many places in the northern region of Israel are Arab, right? So he suggested there to be land swaps, right? So he basically said, right, some of these territories which are predominantly Arab speaking on the borders, they should be given to Palestine. And what was the reaction of the Israeli Arabs, right? Were they all rushing to join with their brethren in Palestine? No, in actual fact, you found that a poll taken by an Arab-speaking newspaper at the time, in one of the communities that was there, they found that 83% of Israeli Arabs living in that community were opposed to joining with Palestine and wanted to stay with Israel. And that's obviously because Israel is a democratic state, it's a very prosperous state, etc., etc. And it's obviously, as much as it is officially the Jewish state of Israel, it still is a thing where all groups, all ethnicities, all religions are still welcome to be there, right? And they have a lot more freedom in Israel than they would within any kind of a Palestinian state. So, again, how many people are aware of this? Yes, there's occupation. Yes, it's not yes, there's many problems with it. It's definitely not a perfect situation at all, right? Yes, there's many problems, and there's many flaws that the Israelis have. But at the same time, how many people are aware of simple talking points like that when they're kind of arguing about these kind of issues? But of course, no conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, can really, you can't really talk about it without including what the people on the ground think of the situation, right? And that's where we look at an opinion poll. And I chose an opinion poll taken in 2017. So you had a recent flare-up in 2014, and obviously you've had the recent flare-up now in 2021. So I picked a poll taken in the middle of these kind of things. So this at a time when tensions aren't running too high. This is just this is normal. This is 90% of the time, people, even Palestinian tour guides, that I had when I was out in West Bank and stuff, they said actually, what you see on the news, 90% of the time, people just going about living their everyday life and stuff. Normally there's peace, the natural state of Israel and Palestine, as much as we often only see it when there's war, most of the time it's actually peace. But so this is in one of those long periods of peace, and this is what people in this region thought. So when it comes to the Palestinians as a whole, you find that 18% of them are in favour of the status quo, 21% of them in favour of armed struggle, 9% are in favour of unarmed struggle, and 45% of them want some sort of peace settlement, right? So this is basically what Palestinians as a whole are in favour of. Now, when we break that down in terms of support in West Bank compared to support in Gaza, then we can kind of see actually there's a little bit of difference. So in West Bank, and don't forget West Bank, this is where the settlements are. This is where, there's certain places which are split up. This is where, if you're talking about occupation, this is kind of the epicenter of the occupation, right? And yet you find that 16% of them want the status quo. 17% of them want armed struggle, 9% of them want there to be, an unarmed struggle, and 49% of them want some sort of peace settlement. So in the region which has, the most occupation, which on the face of it, you'd expect them to be the most hostile to it, these are the ones who are most in favour of peace, and they're the least in favour of armed struggle. However, when we compare this to Gaza, which, in 2005, the Israelis, removed all Jewish settlements from there, right, and, basically allowed them to govern themselves and, left them alone. What ended up happening there is as soon as that happened, they had an election in Palestine and, Hamas won, and in particular, they won in Gaza. Hamas and Fatah, which was the other kind of, Fatah is the kind of more like a secular Arab nationalist party. Hamas and Fatah, they end up fighting with each other, and there's basically a civil war. And as a result, there's not been a single election since 2005, in Palestine, right? So, so 16 years. There was actually supposed to be one at the time of me filming this, on the 23rd of May. Yesterday, on the 22nd of May, there was supposed to be a Palestinian election. But again, because of this recent flare-up, it's been postponed again, So, and that's, you can't really say, oh, it's because of like the bombings and stuff, etc., etc. Part of the reason why Hamas was firing the rockets is because they wanted to rally support amongst the Palestinians, to be able to say, look at us, like we're the people who are going to stand up for your rights against the Israelis. But in Gaza, you find that 22% of them want the status quo, 28% of them want armed conflict, 10% want unarmed conflict, and just 37% of them want some sort of peace settlement. So actually, in the region where there's not an occupation, you tend to find that these people are actually the angriest people, right? And they're the ones who are most gunning for war. And you can say, oh, Israel is blockading them, but the question is, why is Israel blockading them? Like, if Israel wanted to, it could blockade many places. It could blockade the whole of Lebanon if it wanted to. It could blockade probably all of Syria if it wanted to, etc., etc. Like, it has the military power to do much, much more than it is. So why is it blockading Gaza? The reason is because Hamas is linked to Iran. And they know that as soon as they lift that blockade, that Iran is going to sell missiles, much stronger missiles, much deadlier missiles, more accurate missiles with a bigger payload and potentially like biological or whatever kind of weapons, So they know that, there's a reason for the blockade, So as much as like vital supplies are not getting to Gaza, it's also a situation where the reason for the blockade in the first place is because they know that as soon as they lift it, then Hamas is going to start firing missiles into Israel. So that's the real reason why there's a blockade on Gaza. And finally, with regard to Israeli Jews, we can see that 18% of them in favour of the status quo, 12% of them in favour of annexation, 9% of them are in favour of a war against the Palestinians, and 45% of them in favour of some sort of peace agreement, So we can see that, broadly speaking, Palestinians want peace and the Israelis want peace. However, when we look at the Jewish settlers, living within the West Bank and stuff, right? So these people who tend to be more like fervently Jewish and stuff, they tend to be like Orthodox Jews, tend to be very like religious Jews, and for them, they kind of see it as like, they're trying to kick the Muslims out, and they're trying to basically as I said, like expand like throughout the whole of the Holy Land. So for them kind of like settling there is kind of, it's in a fulfillment with like what they believe like God has wanted them to do. So these people, regardless whether the Israeli government wants them to do it or not, they keep like kind of doing it and stuff, right? And actually, a lot of people within Israel proper like kind of allow them to do it because they have so much influence within the Israeli state. However, when we see their levels of support for the different categories, we can see that 35% of them in favour of the status quo, 24% of them in favour of annexation, 10% of them in favour of war with the Palestinians, and 15% of them, just 15%, are in favour of a peace settlement. So actually we can see on both sides of this conflict, the people who are, the religious fanatics on the Muslim side and on the Jewish side, these are people who, as we said before, like they're not really in the game of compromise, right? Because if you believe that your God has told you that this land is yours, it's quite difficult to sit around and negotiate that kind of thing, right? It's a very fundamental thing. And so this is the problem, So people who are moderates on both sides of the argument, the ordinary people within Israel and Palestine who just want peace, who just want, they want that 90% of the time when it's peace. They want it to be 100% of the time. They want the thing to be settled. They want, a clear distinction between Israel and Palestine. They want a two-state solution. And in particular, the Israeli Arabs, they're most in favour of it. Something like 81% of them. They want a two-state solution. So, this is the problem. you have people on either side, at the extreme of either side, who have an all or nothing kind of approach to it. And this is part of what is driving the conflict, yeah, in this present day. It's the, the setting up of settlements there. It's the fact of, people on the other side, wanting to have like the whole of the region and to kick out all the Jews or to kick out all the Arabs, etc. This is the problem. So until like the more moderate voices are able to really drown out those extremes, yeah, and to really, stand up and say, no, we actually want peace, we're fed up of this, there will always be this conflict. And it's not about picking one side and picking another side, etc. It's about how do we work together in a way that actually promotes peace and general well-being, yeah, both for the Palestinians and for the Israelis, yeah, because this is the problem, yeah, like this conflict will, every few years, is going to flare up again, in 4 or 5, or like 7 years or 10 years, whatever, this problem is going to flare up again because it hasn't been resolved. And it's a thing where, as much as people have tried to compromise, much people have tried to make some sort of negotiations, it's quite difficult where, you have one side which is trying to offer land and trying to make some sort of negotiations, yeah, and the other side as to saying, no, we want to have all of it and we don't want to recognize you, etc. You can understand it from a Palestinian point of view, you can understand it from an Israeli point of view, and hopefully this video has helped to, make people think outside of their little tribes that they're in and stuff. Yeah, hopefully if you're on the left, hopefully you understand why people on the right support, and if you're on the right, hopefully it's helped people on you to understand what people on the left are kind of saying. And hopefully through this, yeah, I'm not saying this one video is going to create peace in the Middle East kind of thing, but hopefully these kind of conversations and other people like this who are trying to make conversations like this, yeah, who are trying to work out how to kind of solve this in the same way I did with the Irish question, yeah, when to check that video out. It's the same kind of thing, yeah. It's a thing of we have to respect both sides, yeah, and we have to understand where both sides are coming from and their fears and their anxieties and their hopes and their dreams and stuff, because otherwise this is just never going to be resolved, and it's going to, and if it is to be resolved, it'll be in bloodshed, and I don't think, hopefully no one wants that. So with that being said, yeah, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, definitely hit the like button, share with people as well. Check all my videos, over 100 at the moment. We cover a whole big range of different topics. So there must be one video that you like, and share with another friend, because that will help the channel to grow. Subscribe if you haven't already. There's obviously a lot of people who have watched this for the first time. Hopefully this video attracts a lot of newcomers and stuff. And yeah, so subscribe. And also, we're continuing with the alternative history one. I know this was a bit of a break from that because I thought it was so important to kind of touch on it, but also I didn't want to do it right in the middle of the actual conflict itself. At the time of filming this, there seemed to be a bit of a ceasefire being arranged, so hopefully people are a little bit calmer than they would have been a week or two ago, yeah, kind of while watching this. So yeah, so we're finishing off the alternative history one. The next video is going to be on what if the Confederacy existed today. So so definitely check that out. That was suggested by one of our contributors, Thomas Watson. So if you have any ideas for alternative history or any ideas for kind of topics that you'd like me to kind of touch on, as long as they're sensible, as long as they're not divisive, as long as I think I can actually say something unique and with a bit of understanding with it and stuff, yeah, then I'm quite happy to do a video on it. So that being said, have a great day and bye.